Okay, so today I had a request to do more glute and hamstring movements. So we're starting with what should be at the core of all of your glute and hamstring work, which is a Romanian deadlift. Straight leg deadlift is a good variant for this as well, or stiff leg, depending on what you hear people say. But there are a couple key differences between them. So I will point those out kind of today as we go along, but the emphasis is going to be on a Romanian deadlift. So for those who are familiar with the conventional deadlift, Romanian deadlift is not horribly different in terms of still being a deadlift, but there's a lot of nuance to the setup that you need to keep in mind, because the goal of the Romanian deadlift is going to be targeting the hamstring and the glute. And generally, it's not very easy to break down movements by percentages, so I don't like doing that, but generally speaking, you're going to get a little bit more emphasis on the glute with a Romanian deadlift and a little bit more emphasis on the hamstring with a stiff leg deadlift. They're both going to hit both, and it's honestly personal preference what you like to do more. I personally prefer a Romanian deadlift over a stiff leg just because of the setup, and it allows me to load a little heavier than I would in a stiff leg. So we're going to be doing the Romanian primarily here. There's one key difference, again, I'll show you guys that. But starting off, for the Romanian, you can start from the floor if you have the flexibility for it. I generally don't recommend that, especially for someone who hasn't done the movement before. So it would be better to start from an elevated position, okay? Slightly above the knee as your starting point, and then that's where you're gonna unrack and rack from, okay? Now, you also can do Romanian deadlifts with a dumbbell instead of the barbell. I prefer that. I'm just gonna show you guys on the barbell because a lot more people will start off on this, and it is a little bit better if you do start on this just to get the pattern down. Again, personally, I prefer it with a dumbbell. One thing you'll notice is with the barbell, you're stuck out in front of you like this. With the dumbbell, I can come a little bit closer, keep those shoulders a little further back, which allows me to better roll through my back and get into a better position for the start of the movement, okay? You're gonna wanna take roughly a shoulder width grip, okay? Doesn't have to be exact, on the bar, right? As with any deadlift variant, but specifically the Romanian deadlift and the stiff leg, you're gonna wanna keep this bar as close to your legs as you possibly can, okay? As you start going up in weight, that's probably just gonna drag along the legs. You're not really gonna be able to avoid that. But from this position, your feet are also going to be set just about shoulder width. So one additional thing I'll say about the feet here is there's a lot of personal preference with how you set up for this in terms of where you wanna feel it or how your knees feel with this. So if you are keeping your toes straight, then you might feel a little bit more in the hamstring, but you might also be at a little more risk for inducing some knee pain. So find a foot placement that works for you, point it out slightly, straightforward, whatever. Some people do a little better with their feet at a closer distance than wider apart. I personally like a slightly shoulder width, slightly toes out angle for the feet, okay? Another keynote with the feet here is when you are doing this movement, you will want ideally a flat shoe. I obviously have Hokas on right now that have this giant padded sole that's super thick. I wouldn't recommend doing any sort of deadlift in a shoe like this. However, a lot of people will do this movement barefoot, and I also kind of caution against that. I would prefer a shoe with some arch support, even if it's a little bit, and just allows you to kind of have that structure of the foot compacted a little bit to really grip the ground. But if you need to do it barefoot, if you don't have flat sole shoes, that's fine. Do that instead of something with a ton of elevation and padding to it, okay? Now, getting back into the core of the movement itself, okay? You're gonna grab that bar, you're set up in the feet, you're set up in the shoulders. What do we do with the body? Well, the first thing we wanna do is you're not gonna be like this, okay? Your head and back are gonna be straight. You're gonna pull your chin to your chest. As we do with pretty much every back movement, it's the same thing here because we are setting up through the back. Even though this is a hamstring and glute movement, this is also going to give you some work with your spinal erectors, your low back, okay? So we're setting up for this in the upper body like this is a back movement. So you're gonna pull that chin back, you're gonna keep that chest up like so, and then you're going to keep those shoulders back and locked. Now your low back, you shouldn't be rounding out your low back or your upper back, but specifically your low back. You want to keep that in and straight, or almost slightly lordosis in the low back, okay? Which means your spine is almost a little bit like that. if you are bending in and then this is your upper body here, okay? Not rounded out the opposite direction where your back is rounding in your low back, okay? This is a movement where a lot of people have a tendency to round the low back just because you are moving in a pattern that doesn't have any movement at the knees, only at the hip. To touch on that, when I say moving at the hip only, when you are all set up, okay, you've got everything locked in, for a Romanian deadlift, you are only moving at the hip. You are only hinging at the hip. You are not just lowering your upper body down. You're also not coming down with your knees, okay? Coming down with the knees would be a conventional deadlift. So you're not bending at the knee, but you're also not locking out at the knee. You have a slight bend, not bending at the knee, not just dropping the torso down like this and rounding at the back. You are keeping that bar as close to your legs as possible, keeping the body set up, and you are kicking the hips back like that. Never losing the posture in that low back, but only kicking the hips straight back, okay? And only go as low as you can go. You don't need to go all the way down to the ground with this. Obviously, we want to improve the range of motion over time, but as you start out, you're probably not gonna be able to get that. So you're just kicking the hips back to come down, okay? Now, another thing on head positioning here. When you are coming down through the movement, I don't want you doing this and looking up in the mirror. I know it's nice to look at yourself. I know you want to see yourself and how you're doing it in the mirror. Don't. Keep a neutral spine. Keep that spine straight. So as you are dropping through the movement, that head is down, okay? Not exaggerated down. I don't want you to round. Keep the chin tucked to the chest and come down. Neutral spine the whole way down and up. When I say you're driving the hips back, I'll try and turn at a little bit of an angle here. You aren't, again, just doing this. You're not bending over. You're not coming down at the knees. You are taking your hips and pinning them back like you're trying to push them against the wall, like this. That's it. That bar, or if you're using dumbbells, the bar of the dumbbell needs to stay as close to the leg as possible, okay? For the stiff leg deadlift, that is where the nuance is. The Romanian is all in the hip and the hip movement, whereas a stiff leg is going to be that upper torso coming down with a little less hip movement, okay? So you'll see I can actually get a little bit more range when I do that, but I lose out on a little bit of activation in the glute and also start to round a little bit more in the back. Just for me, that's a mobility thing. I would recommend starting out with Romanians and then transitioning into a stiff leg deadlift if you feel like you need to do that movement more than the Romanian. But again, they're both gonna hit the same things, okay? And at the top of the movement, last thing to touch on here. When you are coming up, so let's go through the motion. You do not need to come up and do one of these. I don't want you coming up and thrusting like this, okay? All you need to do is come up. So about here, you don't even really need to lock out. You just need to come up high enough that you are, I would say, about 3/4 of the way up your quad, up your thigh, and then go back down, okay? We're not trying to lock out and thrust through the weight here, because at that point, all you're doing is engaging more in the low back, which is fine if you need additional low back work, but there's no real reason to do it. It's not benefiting anything for the primary reason that we're actually performing the movement. So, start to finish. Shoulder width stance, toes wherever you find them comfortable, okay? And keep those knees from falling inward. You don't want your knees to buckle inward like this, so just keep them in line with the leg. Grab the bar, the dumbbells, and bring them as close to the leg as possible. And then shoulders back, chin tucked to the chest, low back in, but not thrusted forward, just in, and then kick back at the hips. Neutral spine the entire time, no movement in my head. About 3/4 of the way up and back down. That's it. Really simple movement. Not a lot of complexity to it. If you want to try different variations, like I said, try a dumbbell instead of a barbell. For me personally, I prefer a dumbbell just because it allows me to be a little bit more on the outside of the leg, so I can more naturally keep my shoulder back and keep my low back in position than I can with a barbell. So I can actually load, personally, the dumbbells a little higher than I can with the barbell. Dumbbell, I think I do I don't remember, 115, 120 kilos, but with a barbell, it's a little less. Probably about 100 kilo, just because of the positioning. Now that's for me. Bigger guys might also have an issue with that. It might be a little better for mobility if you're using a dumbbell around the side of the leg, but generally speaking, barbell will work for most people, and it's where I recommend most people start. So that is going to cover the RDL this week. That's the only thing we're going to cover this week, but we will do more hamstring work in the future, next week potentially. Probably some lying leg curls, some seated leg curls. Pretty easy stuff to set up for, but this is a core compound movement that I would really recommend if you need to bring up your hamstrings, if you need to bring up your glutes. Most guys do. At the very least, their hamstrings they need to bring up. Glutes aren't so important, but most guys are lacking hamstring, myself included. So this is a big focus and something that will really help bring those up in conjunction with your lying leg curl, seated leg curl, standing single leg curl. If you have access to that, any of those variants will generally do the same thing, okay? Plus hip thrusts if you need some additional work in there, okay? We will touch on those, like I said, but for now, guys, that is going to be it. So make sure to like, subscribe, comment what you want to see, turn on your notifications, all that good stuff. And until next time, take it easy.